you. Well, evening, everyone. After a week's break, we're back again, ready to go with another reflection on one of the themes of Luke's Gospel. Tonight, good news for the poor, a program of action. One of the most abused sayings of Jesus, I suppose, is, "The poor you always have with you." It has been conveniently interpreted by some, probably those who are better off economically, as there will always be poor people and there's not a lot can be done about them. The poor will always be there. Sometimes it's even said it's their own fault, but they are poor. They need to stop being lazy and work hard like the rest of us. That analysis is flawed, based on an individualism and a sense of one's own autonomy, the self-sufficient individual. But we are social beings, and life is bound up with and shaped by systems. This is not to say that there is no individual or personal responsibility in life, but we live within systems, political, economic, and cultural. And it is systems that leave us at times advantaged or disadvantaged. Economic systems create poverty and inequalities, which is why we rightly recognize a poverty trap. If we end up at the bottom of the economic pyramid, it can be very difficult to escape from it. The system can keep you there. Systems, though, can be challenged and changed. Government policies can ensure a fairer distribution of wealth and goods and resources. Poverty can be alleviated, if not always eliminated, though justice, I suppose, will pursue elimination. The ethical driver in the effort to eliminate poverty is justice. Inequalities and marginalization are because of injustices, economic and political. And just economics and just politics are primary ethical challenges, because we have economic and political justice. Because when we have economic and political justice, human beings on the earth can flourish, and earthlings on the earth can share a common good. Now, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles were written, it's believed, by the same person. The author is named in the tradition as Luke, but we don't really know who wrote the Gospel and Acts, nor any of the other three Gospels. Naming the author was not as important in the 1st or 2nd century as it may be for us. It is convenient more than historical to use the name Luke. Now, whoever Luke was, he was not Jewish, but a Gentile Christian who reflects a Gentile culture in both books. Luke is very concerned with life in the Greco-Roman world, where there is an abysmal gap between rich and poor. In Gospel and Acts, the big concern is with poverty and wealth. Luke is profoundly troubled with this socio-economic chasm, and he believes that the church, the community of faith, should be profoundly troubled and taking action. Often Luke's Gospel is read in pietistic and individualistic ways, and Acts read as a book about a charismatic movement or church growth, when the big concern of both books is the unjust and disturbing gap between rich and poor, wealth and poverty. Luke Acts is one book with a common theme of justice, socio-economic justice. We may need to relearn how to read this single book by reading it in its socio-political and economic context, which is the context of the dominating and oppressive system of Roman Empire. We also read the Gospel and Acts as the faith community's mandate for life and action in a real historical world. In Gospel and Acts, we engage with the Church's manifesto, our programme of action, and that was Luke's intention. In Luke 4, verses 16 to 30, we have a story of Jesus turning up in his hometown synagogue at Nazareth. Luke, in writing his gospel, has begun with 2 chapters of birth stories, including Mary's song of revolution, and a brief story of the birth of Jesus, and a much longer story of shepherds and an army of angels singing a song of peace for all. He then put in stories of baptism and temptation of Jesus, symbolic of Jesus' very real struggle with how he would have to do and what he had to do if faithful to God's purpose and way of working in the Roman imperial world. And here Luke is challenging the church to think deeply about its identity and its own struggle with temptations to live other than the way of God in the world. And then Luke has Jesus come home to Nazareth, read the appointed reading from the scroll of Isaiah, and announce the beginning of his life's work. The key verses in the narrative are, and you recognize them, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This has been described as Jesus' manifesto, what his life's work and program of action would be in his world of Galilee. Luke's intention is that the faith community for whom he writes the Gospel and Acts will hear this and respond to it as their manifesto. If this was the manifesto of Jesus, then it is our manifesto also. The church is to bring good news to the poor. Luke is quoting the Greek translation of Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. He appears to do his own editing because he omits a phrase from Isaiah 61 and he inserts a phrase from Isaiah 58, verse 6. Interestingly, Luke leaves out the day of vengeance of our God. He inserts to let the oppressed go free. Luke also omits from Isaiah 61 the phrase to bind up the brokenhearted. It's not clear why he left out the brokenhearted, but by taking out the vengeance clause, Luke was perhaps removing a negative and putting the main emphasis on the strengthening and compassionate activity of Jesus. Perhaps Luke was reminding the faith community that their role and activity in the world has to do with compassion, not vengeance. At the heart of this program of action is good news for the poor. Now, the Greek word is euangelion, which is a Roman imperial word used by the emperor to describe what he was bringing to the people of the empire. It was, the emperor believed, good news of peace through victory and justice through the suppression of resistance. The Greek word means good news or gospel. Now, gospel has become a very religious kind of word, but it simply and profoundly means good news. But Luke has good news way beyond anything a Roman emperor could bring. The good news of God made visible in the words and the actions of Jesus are for the poor, the captives, the blind, and the oppressed. These 4 categories of people appear all the way through Luke Acts. The umbrella term is the poor. And in Luke, the poor are those at the bottom of the economic pile who do not have the basics for survival. They do not have enough to eat, and they are in poor health. The mortality rate is high, and they have little or no hope because the systems oppress them and keep them at the bottom of the pile. They are in serious debt, having lost what little land they had, and the heavy taxation system gives them no breaks at all. The Spirit of the Lord The energy, power, and presence of the God of life has empowered Jesus to bring good news of liberation and justice to the poor and the marginalized. And the same spirit, energy, power, and presence of the sacred empowers the community of faith to opt for the poor and bring liberating good news. Luke's key theme of liberating justice and divine empowerment is all in the context of the kingdom or empire of God. God's radically alternative empire, the liberating activity of God, is for and among the poor. Warren Carter puts it in these words, quote, "Some folks experienced significant vulnerability, a lack of power and privilege, personal and structural brokenness, limited resources that frequently resulted in poor nutrition and diseases of deprivation and contagion, social disdain, marginalization. To be poor then meant to be vulnerable to regular food crises and their often fatal consequences, exclusion from various forms of social and political participation, personal and social shame, indignity and envy and the desperation of not being able to generate enough, whether clothing, food, shelter, or social respectability." Jesus declares that among these poor folks is the ruling activity of God. It was Latin American Christians who recovered the gospel and the role of the church when they articulated the powerful vision of God's preferential option for the poor. It is the church's option, and if it is among the poor that there is the ruling activity of God, then it is among the poor that those who claim to be participants in God's alternative empire and activity are also present and active with good news. Let's stop there, and maybe we can go into groups for about 20 minutes. There are two questions. At this stage, Luke intends the Jesus Manifesto to be the church's manifesto. Now, what would that mean for the contemporary church? And does the community of faith have a preferential option for the poor? If not, why not? And why should it have? Let's see where we get with a conversation around those two questions, and maybe any other questions that have arisen for you in the last 10, 12 minutes or so. 20 minutes, Loretto. Wow.
I'll go down again.
I'll take a less elevated roll call. Let's look at a little heading, "Let the oppressed go free," and begin with the African experience of colonialism. It remains an experience of economic exploitation. Europe, if you like, has plundered Africa during the modern era. There were four key moments. The first was when millions of Africans were shipped as cargo and like cattle out of the continent, and the slave trade robbed Africa of the labor it needed for its economic development. The second moment was the exploitation of African slave labor in the plantations and the mines in the Americas. African slaves were not paid, but their slave labor funded the modern European project and its developing imperialism and colonialism. The third moment was at the end of the 19th century, when the scramble of Africa took place, when 7 European colonial powers occupied Africa. 85% of Africa by 1905. Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal drained Africa of its human and natural resources, exploiting the continent for the economic benefit of Europe. The fourth moment is now, when Africa finds itself in debt slavery with a poor continent financing the developing countries of the world, which is still mainly Europe. The debt slavery is controlled by the global financial institutions created by the US and the European powers, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. Africa cannot pay its debt, the conditions being so demanding. The Chinese are now in Africa with huge investment and lesser conditions around repayments. But the Chinese are largely in those regions rich in resources and where the mineral resources are being taken out as the price of investment. So we've had 60 years or so of decolonization, but Africa's economies are still subject, it seems, to colonial ordering. Will Africa ever be decolonized? Will it ever be liberated from debt slavery? And will the oppressed ever go free? Africa's debt slavery means that the continent suffers most from climate warming and environmental degradation. Africa has produced thousands of economic refugees, and now and in the years ahead will produce probably thousands of eco-refugees. And the problem of refugees will not go away. These people head to Europe, and they are here because we were there. So we need to enlarge our historical narrative and robustly interrogate our imperial histories of Europe and the imperial legacies that are still with us. The history of Ireland, Britain, and Europe is a history of empires, slavery, racism, and colonialism. And I suppose we cannot know who we truly are unless we recognize and acknowledge our place in European imperialism and its economic exploitation, and are being beneficiaries of that imperialism and its legacies. And our public theology focus at Drumalis will in fact switch early in 2022 to the theme of living with imperial legacies. Now, the Bible from beginning to end, it seems to me, is a narrative of resistance to empires and their economic exploitation and oppression. And this is what underlies the announcement of good news to the poor in the Lucan narrative of Jesus' Nazareth contribution to Sabbath worship. Luke is also suggesting in his narrative that Jesus traveled around Galilean villages and synagogues, and it was not just in Nazareth that the good news to the poor was announced. This was what Jesus was about, his program of action, his life's work. And for Luke, it was also the program of action for the Jesus movement, the Acts of the Apostles, the church in the world. We stand back for a moment and remember that as Catholics and Protestants, we took the Christian faith to Africa. We traveled often with the empires to proclaim the gospel, the good news of Jesus to what were considered the pagans and benighted children. We brought good news to darkest Africa, and darkest Africa, the very expression was a moral judgment. We were the enlightened Europeans. But what was the good news? Where was the good news in those 4 moments of African history and experience? In the economic exploitation of Africa from the 15th century to the present, was there good news of freedom and liberation? It was not all bad, and the missionaries were not all bad people, not by any means, but churches, Catholic and Protestant, built their own empires and were caught up and were often part of imperial systems which enriched Europe and left Africans oppressed and in economic poverty. It is, I suppose, something of a paradox that a continent like Africa, still in debt slavery, is where the Christian majority in the world now exists, and not in Europe. Quoting from Isaiah, Jesus, according to Luke, saw his God-empowered program of action as letting the oppressed go free. The quotation was from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Greek word is aphesios and means release. It is also translated in our English Bibles as forgiveness. And there are contexts in Luke Acts where forgiveness of sins is the point. In this sense, it is release from a past. We are set free from a past of failing to be all that we ought to have been or were meant to be. And this is fine so long as sin is not reduced to a few bad habits or failures in sexual morality. Biblical sin is about systems and structures that destroy life together. Sin is injustice, economic and political. Sin is violence against humans and nature. Sin is oppression and exploitation. Sin is being anti-neighbor and anti-earth. Sin is domination of others and the earth. And to be released and liberated from these oppressive systems, either as colluders, collaborators, or victims, is good news of forgiveness or release. The key meaning of release in the Lucan narrative is release from debts. Now, this is not surprising, as life in Galilee was not only being in a poverty trap for most, it was being trapped in debt by the exploitative system being operated by the Romans and the elite few who owned the large chunks of land and were also the high priestly caste at the heart of the temple being the center of the banking system, as well as conservative and highly ordered, controlled religion. Galilee, like contemporary Africa, lived in debt slavery. Isaiah 61 may have been the lectionary reading for that Sabbath, or Jesus may have deliberately opened the scroll at Isaiah 61 because this was the template and the framework for all that he felt divinely empowered to do. Now, centuries before the third part of the composite book of Isaiah was invoking an old Jubilee tradition, there were much earlier versions. Ancient Israel was always concerned with economics and neighborliness. Life was about just economics and neighbors in solidarity. That's the common good. Behind Isaiah 61 is Leviticus 25, a promise or an ethical demand for a year of release from economic exploitation and oppression from debt slavery. It was a remarkable piece of social legislation designed to give the poor a new start. The Jubilee Year, the 7th or the 50th year, was about release from debts, the return of land wrongly and unjustly taken from the poor. The earth was also rested, lying fallow for a year to restore its generativity and fertility. Soil needs a rest. We deplete it and destroy it. Above all, concern for the poor motivated the Jubilee social legislation. It was to ensure that there would be no permanent underclass in society. It was also to ensure that the land, the earth, was not impoverished. Not only was Jubilee resistance to empire and the economics of exploitation characteristic of every empire, it is also resistance to every domination system that dominates, exploits, and oppresses people and the earth. It is about justice being realized, people and the earth being liberated and released from the poverty trap, the debt slavery, to practice restorative justice and restore all to a place of dignity and worth in community. Jubilee was no small, incidental biblical theme. it was central, present in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, 3rd Isaiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, in Matthew's Lord's Prayer, here in Luke's Nazareth Manifesto, and it is the basis of Paul's great vision of social reconciliation in 2 Corinthians 5 through to 8. For Paul, reconciliation is about just economics and a just earth. In Luke's narrative, Jesus was not calling for a special designated year. He was calling for the Jubilee principle of economic justice and equilibrium to be practiced as the alternative to the exploitative and oppressive economics of the empire or domination system. And if the Lucan church is serious, or if the contemporary struggling Western post-colonial church is serious, then the principle of Jubilee, letting the oppressed go free, is our business and our program of action. Some group work again in rooms. Two other questions. Does Western Christianity share any part of the colonization of Africa and its legacies? And this expression from Luke's Gospel, let the oppressed go free, who are the oppressed today? And has the community of faith, or the community of faiths, not just Christianity, any role in their liberation? We can do another 20 minutes in groups.